Profile Service is a simple to use open source module for handling all of your data store needs. It has quite a few benefits over the normal data stores, such as easy to learn and eventually forget, which is the biggest reason that I'm recommending using this. It's also built for massive scalability. It already does the things you wouldn't dare script yourself, but should, such as session locking, which keeps your data protected from multiple server editing, and that's a potential cause of item loss or item duplication loopholes. It also has an intuitive API, which allows you to handle a lot of this stuff yourself. And the last one listed is that it's made for ambitious projects. Within the profile service, you have these objects called profiles. Now, they're not only locked to player instances, you can also create them for other entities such as group-owned houses, multiplayer game instances, and more. On top of everything that I've listed, this is an open source module, so you can see all the code yourself. Additionally, it's been around since 2020 and has become pretty popular within the community along with data stores too. Now, if we look inside of the tutorial and we check out the basic usage of this, we can quickly see why this might be a better recommendation for using this to save data within your first game rather than learning all the things that come with data stores. Although this is a little confusing and we'll actually add all this into our game ourselves and go through it step by step, what happens is when a player first joins the game, you're going to try to load their profile. If you're unable to load their profile for some reason, you're going to kick them. But if you are able to load their profile, then you're going to run a couple of functions, which will just do a couple of things. And then finally, you'll add the profile to a list so that you can later modify or work with that profile. And then once you add the profile to the list, we know that it's loaded. So we can do something with that profile. And that's what they're doing in this example function right here. So now when this function is called, we pass through the player and the profile. And inside of the profile, you have a table known as data. And this is all the data that you actually save. So for instance, right here, we have data.cache. So this is one of the variables of the player that we're going to be saving inside of their data. But when we call this function, we modify the login times of the data table and we add 1 to it. So right here, we're modifying the player's data currently, and we don't have to do anything else for this to actually be saved. The profile services will automatically handle all of the saving. It'll take into account if the server's shutting down, if the player leaves the game, if the player's game crashes, and everything else like that that you can think of. All you have to do is load the player's profile, add the profile to a list so that we can access it later and use that to modify the data directly from the profile. And that's all that you have to worry about. Everything else is handled by the profile service, making this so easy and not complicated at all to use. If we take a look at the official Roblox data store, which the profile service uses, but basically gives us a very simple and easy to use API for handling all this stuff, the data store is so much more complicated where you're having to use P-calls for certain things. You're also forced to handle the saving. You also need to make sure that you're not saving or getting players' data too often. Otherwise, you're going to hit a limit and then it's going to stall. And of course, using the basic data stores doesn't come with any of the extra features profile services offers, such as session locking and other really useful things like that. So now that we've gone over all the really good reasons as to why you probably should be using profile service, let's get into how to actually set this up in your own game and start using it. The setup is very simple. You can get the model directly from the Roblox website right here. I'll leave a link down below in the description, or you can also get it from the GitHub repository, but it's probably more simple to get it directly from Roblox. Now, if you get it from Roblox, you can add it directly into your game, and you want to make sure that you move it directly into the server script service. Now, I'm going to create a folder because I always store all of my external module scripts that I don't make myself in a folder called libs. Libs is short for libraries. Then what we're going to do is we're going to create a folder inside of the server script service, and we're going to rename this to player data. Inside of this folder, we're going to add a module script called template, and this is actually going to be the table of data that we want our players to have. So for instance, let's modify the module table right here, and we're going to say cash. So when the player joins our game, we want them to actually start with 50 cash. Additionally, we might have another currency called gems, and we want them to start with 0 gems. And let's say that we even have pets inside of our game, and we want the pets to be an empty table. And then we can go a little bit deeper into this too, just to further this example. Let's say that we have boosters in our game, which is a table of common, uncommon, and rare boosters. And we're actually going to set all these to 0 because we don't want the player to start with any boosters. But this is just an example as to how you can set up your data. And this is a really nice way of setting up data that I really like. You also don't need to set up all the data inside of this specific table. Like for instance, if we wanted to, we could take this table that we made right here. We can say local boosters equals, and it'll equal that table that we just created. Instead of creating the table directly into there, we can say that it is equal to this table right here. So it makes it really easy to organize all of your different data. Next, what we're going to do is we will create another module script, and we'll rename this to manager. Now, this module script is actually going to hold all of the profiles when we load them into our game, because we want to easily be able to access that list of profiles so that we can modify each individual player's data. So we're going to create a variable in this module, and that's going to be called profile. profiles, which is going to be an empty table, and we're just going to insert every single profile into this table. Now, finally, let's add a server script inside of this folder, and we'll rename this to data. So the first thing that we want to do inside of this script is we want to get the player's service. Then we want to get the template module script. So we're going to say local template equals require script dot parent dot template. And then finally, we need to actually get the module script as well. So let's also get the server script service, and then we'll require the profile service. So require server script service dot libs dot profile service. Similar to how we work with data stores, we actually need to get the profile store. So we're going to say local profile store equals profile service dot get profile store. And now we need to pass through a string. Similar to how we work with basic data stores, if we pass through test, this will access the test data stores that are only saved in test. Now, when you publish your game for production, you always want to keep this the same one. Otherwise, you're going to wipe all of your players' data, and you don't want to do that. So when I'm publishing to the production, I'll usually set this as live, or maybe you just want to say production. Whatever you want to set it to, just make sure that you remember the string. And it might even be worth adding a comment here that says always set to production when publishing, just so that you never forget that. Then after the string, we want to pass through the template so that it knows the default data to give the player when they join the game if they don't have a profile already created for them. Then we also need to require the manager as well. So we're going to say local manager equals require script dot parent dot manager. And this is where we're going to be storing all of our profiles at. Then we're going to create a new function, and that's going to be called player added, and we're going to accept a player. And this function is going to be called, of course, every single time the player is added, and we'll use that from the player service. So inside of here, the first thing we want to do is we want to actually load the player's profile. So we're going to say local profile equals profile store, not service, load profile async, and we want to pass through a specific key. Once again, similar to how you use the data stores. So our key, you can make up whatever you want. It's just going to be player underscore, and then the player dot user ID, and that'll be each profile's unique key. Then if we're unable to load the profile, so we're going to say if profile equals nil, then we actually want to kick the player. So we're going to say player kick, and we want to pass through a message here. The message that we're going to pass through is data issue, try again shortly. If issue persists, contact us. And then we want to say return so that nothing below this is ran. So if the profile doesn't load, it's going to kick the player, and then it's going to stop this function from running right at this point and not continue any further down. So outside of that if statement, if we get to this point right here, that means that the player wasn't kicked, the profile was loaded successfully, and we're going to do everything that we want to do with the profile now. So we want to call add user ID, and we want to pass through the player.user ID to the profile. This is for the GDPR compliance. Then we're going to call profile reconcile, and we're not going to pass anything to this function. This function simply fills in missing variables from the profile template. You don't need to use this, but I would recommend using this because if you add data to your profiles later, then you could come into some errors, and this is a really useful function. Then to the profile, once again, we're going to say listen to release, and we're actually going to create an anonymous function inside of here, and we're going to remove the profile from the list. So we're going to say manager.profiles, and we're going to try to index the player of that list, and we're going to set it to nil so that we remove the player's profile from that list. You might be thinking, well, we didn't even add it to the list yet. Don't worry, we'll get to that in a sec. And then we also want to kick the player as well, because this can occur if the profile loaded from another server. So we're just going to pass through the same error right here. We could make this into a constant if we wanted to and a variable up at the top, but I'm just going to leave it as is. So after we added the user ID, we reconciled, and then we also listened to release. We then want to check if the player is descendant of the player service. And if that equals true, then we're going to actually add the profile to the list. So we're going to say manager.profiles. We'll set the player, and then we're going to set that equal to the profile. So now we just added this profile to the list, and now we can actually do something with the profile. So let's create a new function up here called give Leaderstats, and we're just going to accept the player, and then we'll do something with that in a second. So we'll just call the give Leaderstats function and pass through the player. And now if this does not equal true, we're going to say else. So if it doesn't equal true, then we just want to release the profile. So if the player is not a descendant of the player's service, that means that the player left before the profile has been loaded. So just to quickly go through this function once again, when we call this function, we're going to call this function when the player first joins the game. What we're going to try to do is we're going to try to get the player's profile from the profile store using this specific key right here. Now, if the profile equals nil, meaning there could be a couple of different errors, even on Roblox end, like the data stores could be down, or there might be some other issues, then we're just going to kick the player, and we're using return to stop this function from running further down. So now if the profile doesn't equal nil, it's just going to continue through here. And then we're going to call a function on the profile, which adds the user ID. This is going to be compliant with the GDPR. Then we're also going to call the reconcile function as well on the profile. And this is going to fill in the missing variables from our template. Then we're also going to call the listen to release method as well. And when this is called, it's going to remove the profile from our profiles list, and it'll also kick the player as well. Now this could occur if the profile is loaded on another Roblox server. Then after adding all of those, we're checking if the player is a descendant of the player's service. And if it is, then we know that the profile has been loaded successfully and everything's good to go. So we add the profile to this list, and we also can start running any of the functions that we want to use based off of the player's profile and player data that's now been loaded. Now, if the player is not a descendant of the players, then we're going to release the profile. And this means that the player left before the profile has been loaded. Now, the next thing that we can do is we can actually listen to when the player joins the game. So we're going to say players.playerAdded connect, and the function that we're going to just connect is the player added, just like that. Then inside of the give leader stats, we can actually give the player leader stats because we now know that their data has been loaded. So how do we actually get the player's data? Well, we're going to say local profile equals manager.profiles, and we're going to index this with the player. So that's how we're going to get the profile. And now the safest thing that I always like to do is we say if not profile. So if for some reason we're not able to find the profile, we're just going to return end. And this error could be stemming from a couple of different things, but it's just the safest thing that you do so that you don't run into any other errors. So if we're unable to find the player's profile, we're just not going to do anything else in this function. But if we are able to find their profile, then what we're going to do is we're going to actually add the leader stats to them. So we're going to say local leader stats equals instance.new, and we're going to create a new folder. We'll parent that to the player, and we're going to set the leader stats name, the folder name, to leader stats. And if we look at the template of our data, we have the cache and gem. So we'll just say that those will be the leader stats in this example. So we're going to say local cache equals instance.new number value, and we'll parent that to the leader stats. We're going to say the name of cache is cache. We'll set the value of this to profile data. So now when we say data, we're actually getting this whole table right here. So from data, we can now say .cache, .gems, or even .pets or .boosters. And then from boosters, we could of course say common, but this would of course be set to 0. But I'm just showing you guys that this is our data table right now. So we can access every single thing inside of this template. So anyway, of course, from the data, we want to be able to access the cache. So we're going to say profile.data.cache, and we don't have to say .value or anything like that. We can literally just say profile.data.cache. And then we're going to do the exact same thing for the gems. So we're going to say local gems equals instance.new number value, parent that to the leader stats. We'll set the name of it to gems. We'll set the value of it to profile.data.gems. And there we go. So there's two more important things that we want to do. First things first is we actually have to loop through the players that are currently in the game when this script runs, because especially in Studio, players are able to join a Roblox server before this script might actually run. So we're just going to quickly handle that. We're going to say local player in players get players do. Now I might have just blown your brain because you might be thinking, why are you not using I pairs right here? Well, that was a recent change in Roblox, but if that's confusing to you at all, I'll just add I pairs. It's literally the exact same thing, just without writing the word. Yes, it is possible. And now what we want to do inside of here is we want to say task.spawn player added, and we want to pass through the player. So what this means is we're calling this function right here, and we're passing through the player. And finally, we need to listen for when the player leaves the game. So player removing, connect, and we'll create an anonymous function inside of here. And of course, we're going to accept the player as an argument, and we'll get the player's profile. So manager.profiles, pass through the player. If not profile, so if we can't find the profile, then return end. Otherwise, we're going to release the profile. So just like that. Then when we call the release method, it's going to do whatever we put inside of the listen to release method. And so it's going to remove the profile from our list so that we don't have any data leaks. And then it would also kick the player, but considering the player is already leaving, they won't get kicked, so you don't have to worry about that. So with all that being done, let's go ahead, start up our game, and see how this works out. So we can see that in the output, profile service, Roblox API services available, data will be saved. And now we can see that we do have the leader stats set up. We can even check inside of our player. We can see that we have the cache and gems inside here as well. And remember, the cache has been set to 50. The gems have been set to 0 because it's based off of the data that we created inside of the template. Now, you might be really happy to know we don't have to touch this server script anymore. The only time that you ever have to touch this is if you maybe want to modify the profile store that you're working with. Other than that, you're done. You can close that script. And for the template, the only time that you need to modify this is if you're adding new data to the player. So for for instance, let's say you added settings to your game. Well, then you could just add the settings right here. So some of the common settings is like music. By default, we want that to be true. Then we also have sound effects, and we're going to set the default of that to true as well. And you can go on and on, but the only time that you ever have to modify the template is when you add more data, and it's really simple. That's all you have to do. You literally just add the data however you want to, and then you don't have to do anything else. You don't have to make sure that you update anything else to add it to the player's profiles or anything like that. It will automatically do all this for you, which is actually why we're using the reconcile function right here, because that'll automatically add all of the brand new data that we just added for us, meaning that we don't have to do any extra work. So this is my whole point as to why the profile service is just so honestly amazing, because it drastically simplifies the data handling on your game, making it so much less stressful for you having to worry about so many different things that come along with the profile service. Now, there's two things that you're probably wondering. How do we modify the player's data, and how can I replicate that to the player? Let's create a new server script inside of the server script service, and we're going to close the libs folder, and we'll close the player data folder as well. We'll just rename this server script to test, because what we're going to do inside of the server script is modify some of the player's data to kind of treat it like a normal game in a way. So let's go ahead and get the player service inside of here. So local players equals game get service players. Then we'll create an infinite loop. So while true do, and at the bottom, we're going to say task.wait once. So it runs every single second. And then we're going to loop through each of the players. So for underscore player int players get players do. Now, if you guys are brand new to scripting, you might have learned how to create and store player data by only using objects like number values, string values, and things like that. Currently, we're looking at a simulator game that I created for a simulator series on my channel, which was a way to teach brand new scripters how to create a simulator in the most digestible way. And how we do the data storing on here is we store all of that on the player object. So as you see, we have the leader stats right here. We also have a folder called game passes, which inside of here has bool values, and these values will change when the player actually purchases one of the game passes. The same goes for inside of our inventory. So we have a folder called inventory, then we have a string value for the 3 different categories of items that the player can have equipped, and the value is set to the current tool that they have equipped. So for instance, I currently have this French fry tool equipped. If I went to the shop and equipped a different tool, then this bool value would actually change. Now the thing is though, is that with profile services, you're not actually doing it. The only reason that we actually have anything stored inside of our player object is the leader stats, is so that this little leaderboard is displayed up here. Other than the leader stats, which we created ourselves, we don't have any of the data stored right here. So now we need to figure out how we can actually modify the player data. So the way that we can modify the player data, let's go ahead and get the server script service, and then we're going to require the manager module script. So we're going to say local, and I usually just call this profile, or you could even say player data, whatever you want to, it really doesn't matter. Require server script service.player data.manager. And now what you can do is we can say local profile equals player data.profiles index the player. So if not profile, then return end. So if we don't get the profile, then we don't want to do anything. But if we do get the profile, what we want to do is we will print the profile data. So remember, the data is this table right here, so everything inside of here, but with the player specific data. So they might have like 75 cash or 2 gems instead of the default data. So .cash. So we're currently going to print the amount of cash that they currently have. Then what we'll do is we'll increase the cash by 5. So we'll give them 5 cash, and then let's print the cash after we modify it. So we're going to print the player's cash, then give them 5 cash, and then we're going to print it once again. Let's go ahead and start up our game. One last change that we need to make to this is instead of saying return, because we are inside of a while loop and inside of a for loop, when this script runs, it might actually run before any profiles have been added. So we won't be able to find the profile, meaning that this will break out of this loop and it'll break the entire loop. So what we need to do is instead of returning, we just want to continue, meaning this for loop will continue. It'll go to the next player and then run this once again. So now we can start our game and see how this works. So now we see the original number and then plus 5 numbers. So 75, 80, 80, 85, 90, 95, 100, 105, and so on. But one thing we don't see is the leader stats incrementing along with this amount right here. Additionally, if we restart our game, we can see that when the game loads up, the data has saved. So now we have 165 cash and we keep getting 5 more every single time. But once again, the leader stats still isn't updating. Now, the reason that it's not updating is because we're not telling it to. All we're updating right now is the player's profile data. So while yes, this is sort of the official number of how much cash the player actually has, we also have to tell the leader stats to increase that number as well. And the way that we would do this is by saying player.leaderstats.cash profile.value, and then we're just going to set that to be equal to the profile.data.cache. So just like that. So then we can start the game and we can see that we start with our save data, we get the increase 5, and every single time the 5 increases to the profile data, the leader stats is also increasing along with it. So this is working perfectly. Now, while this is a decent way of modifying player data, we can make an even better and more organized way of doing that. So let's go ahead and create a function for doing this. So we're going to say function module.adjust cache, and we're going to accept the player, which is of course going to be a player, and the amount, which is going to be a number. So the amount of cache that we want to either give or subtract from the player. Then inside of here, we're going to of course get the profile. So we're going to say local profile equals module.profiles, index the player, and then if not profile, so if we're not able to find the profile, then we're just going to return end. And if we are able to find the profile, then we're going to say profile.data.cache plus equals whatever the amount is. Now keep in mind, the way that plus equals works is that it'll add the number to the player's cache that they currently have. So if we call the adjust cache function and we say -5, it will subtract 5 from the player's cache. So it's completely okay to always use plus equals, because with this function, we're now able to add or subtract money from the player's balance. We don't have to create two functions, one for adding cache and another one for subtracting cache. And of course, since cache is a leader stat, we also want to modify the player's leader stat value as well to reflect this number. So we're going to say profile.leaderstats.value, and we're going to set that to the profile.data.cache. So then inside of our test script, we don't have to do any of this. We can remove all of that, and all we have to do is we just have to call that function that we just created. So player data.adjust cache, pass through the player, and pass through the amount. So we just want to add 5, and there we go. We can once again start up our game and see how this turns out. So I made a little mistake. I forgot to index cache inside of leaderstats. So player.leaderstats.cache.value, and now we can test how this works. And now we can see once again we're increasing by 5, so we can see in the output the data is updated along with in the leader stats as well. So that's working perfectly. Now the reason that I recommend you creating these methods inside of your manager is because it allows you to centralize the one location where you modify the player's data at. So rather than doing what we were originally doing inside of the test script, which was getting the profile, actually now that I think about it, we don't even need to get the profile at all. We can literally just call this adjust cache method right here, and we don't have to worry about getting the profile, seeing if we got the profile, and then modifying the data. We're already handling that inside of the method right here. Additionally, organizing all of the data modifiers inside of one specific module script allows you to have a lot better control over realizing where all of your players' data can be modified from. So let's say, for instance, you're running into an issue when it comes to modifying the player's data, like something's being subtracted when you don't want it to be. Rather than having to search through all of your scripts where you modify the player's data, you can see, oh, these are all of the methods and the functions that I have for modifying the player's data. One of these is causing it. Let's see which one it actually is. There's a lot of other easier things that come with it as well, such as anytime that I want to adjust the player's cache, which is going to be pretty common. You're probably going to want to do that when the player is supposed to earn money from, say, daily logins or doing an objective like clicking on the screen. You're also going to modify it when they purchase something from the shop. So rather than having to create the profile variable, check if the profile exists, and then modify the data and the leader stats in each of the different scripts, we're doing that all in one script, and all we have to do is require the module, call the method, and boom, the rest is handled for us. Now, the last thing that we should figure out is how can we replicate the data from the player's profile to the player themselves. What I mean by that is, what if the player wants to know how many gems they currently have? Let's take, for instance, the simulator that we have right here. It's really common in simulators to display two currencies in a GUI on the player screen. So for instance, we have a food currency right here, and we also have coins right here as well. Now, for instance, with cash, the player is always able to access or see how much cash they have because we're always updating the leader stats, and the player is able to index this from the cash leader stats right here. They can also do this with gems as well, but we're actually going to remove gems from the leader stats so that we can see how this would work. So let's go into the data script, and where we actually give the leader stats inside of this function right here, let's just comment out all the section which works with the gems. So now the gems is no longer a leader stat. We can start our game to verify this, and now the player has no way of accessing or knowing how many gems they actually have. So what we need to do is we need to actually use remote events and remote functions to communicate between the server and the player so that we can tell the player how many gems they actually have. First things first, let's go inside of the manager and let's actually create a function. We're just going to duplicate this function, and we're going to say adjust gems. So then once again, we're going to have the player and the amount. And then instead of saying data.cache, we're going to say data.gems. And then we're not going to use the leader stats because it's not a leader stat. So now we're modifying the player's gems. Then what we're going to do is inside of the replicated storage, let's create a new folder called remotes and introduce a remote event inside of here. And we'll rename this to gems. Then inside of the manager module, let's go ahead and get the replicated storage. So local replicated storage, get service replicated storage. Then we'll get the remotes folder from the replicated storage. So replicated storage.remotes. And now we can use that folder down inside of the adjust gems method. And we're going to say remotes.gems fire client. Then we'll pass through the player and we'll pass through the amount of gems that the player currently has. So just like that. So every single time we adjust the amount of gems a player currently has, we're going to use a remote event called gems, and we're going to tell the client that this is the amount of gems that they now currently have. So then let's go into the starter player inside of the starter player scripts and create a local script, and we could just rename this to test if we want to. It really doesn't matter. We'll go ahead and get the replicated storage. Then we'll get the remotes folder, just like how we did previously. And then we'll say remotes.gems connect.onClientEvent connect. We'll create a new function inside of here, and the argument is going to accept is the amount, which is going to be a number, and we'll print the amount of gems that we currently have. So we now have amount space gems. So now we're listening for the gems remote event to be fired, and then we will print out the amount of gems that we now have. The last thing that we need to do is we need to actually use the adjust gems method. So inside of our test server script where we adjust the cache, we'll also adjust the gems as well. So adjust gems, and we'll just give the player 2 gems every single time. And let's go ahead and start up our game. So now we see we now have 8 gems, 10 gems, 12 gems, 14 gems. So now every single time we adjust the amount of gems the player has on the server, we're also telling the client how many gems they now have as well. Now, what if we wanted to display the amount of gems that the player currently had inside of a GUI or something like how you would normally do in a simulator? Well, you could easily create the GUI, and you can also just store the amount of gems inside of a variable. So we can say local current gems equals 0, for instance. And then anytime our gems are modified, we can say current gems equals the amount, and then we can use that variable however we would like to. So now another avenue that we'll explore is how from the client side, we can request data from the server. So inside of the remotes folder, we're actually going to create a remote function this time, and we're going to rename that to get gems or request gems, whatever you want to name it. Then inside of the manager, what we'll do is we'll say remotes.get gems.onServerInvoke, and we'll set that to a function, but let's go ahead and create the function up here. So we're going to say local function get gems, and this is just going to accept the player. So on the server invoke, we'll set it to this function right here. And what we'll do is, once again, we'll get the profile as normal. Of course, if the profile doesn't exist, then we're just going to return end, and then we will just return the profile data.gems. So then from the client side, we actually have to use that remote function. So let's get the user input service. So user input service, and then using the user input service, we can say user input service dot jump request. This is just a quick little example of one of the things that we could do to actually request it from the server. And then we can connect that to an anonymous function. And then we'll say current gems is equal to remotes dot get gems invoke server. And then we'll say print you currently have current gems gems. So then we can start our game, and now we see the server is communicating to the client by using that remote event that we currently have. And then when we jump, we can see that you currently have X amount of gems is now printed. So if we have 64, we can now see that when we jump, 64 is also printed because it's being returned from the server. Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, that's it for our tutorial on the profile service. Hopefully this video did help you guys out. Hopefully it taught you all the stuff that you need to know to actually start using profile service, and maybe I even influenced you to actually start using it. If the video did help you guys out or you did enjoy, make sure you smash the like button, also subscribe button, and turn post notifications on if you want to get notified when I upload more Roblox development content. Additionally, I do have a Patreon if you guys like to support me and gain access to a lot of the scripts that I have in my other videos. There's a link down below in the description, and you guys can go and check that out. With that being said, I hope that you guys have a great day, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.